Hey, everybody. My name is Michael Horowitz. I am Richard Perry Professor and the Director of Perry Worldhouse at the University of Pennsylvania. And I'm delighted to welcome you to the final keynote of our 2021 Global Order Colloquium. I'd like to again extend a big thank you to Carnegie Corporation of New York, the Elliott and Harriet Goldstein Private Foundation and Jesse Friedlander, and Paritosh Thakur and Hamal Marani, whose support at Perry Worldhouse helped make this colloquium possible. I'll turn it over to Interim Provost Beth Winkelstein for her introductions in a moment. But before I begin, a few logistical notes. Following the conversation, we'll open the discussion up to questions that have been received from the audience. To ask a question, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom interface in the middle. You'll also see a chat button. Please save the chat area for technical or logistical issues. And we're pleased to be able to offer closed captioning as we want to make our programs as accessible as possible. To start viewing captions, click the closed caption button at the bottom right of your screen, and in the drop-down menu that appears, select Show Subtitle. Finally, please keep it clean and safe for work in the chat and the Q&A, which will help us have a successful event. To introduce today's event, I am delighted to introduce Beth Winkelstein, Penn's Interim Provost and the Eduardo G. Glant President's Distinguished Professor at the University of Pennsylvania. The author of Orthopedic Biomechanics and more than 100 papers and book chapters, she serves as the editor of the Journal of Biomechanical Engineering. Her pioneering research focuses on the mechanisms of bodily injury, especially injuries from sports, automobile accidents, or degenerative diseases. She's taught at Penn since 2002 and is a tremendous leader at the university, now as the interim provost. So I'll now turn the stage over, the virtual stage, to Interim Provost Winkelstein to introduce our event and our distinguished guests. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mike, and welcome everyone. Through the magic of the internet, like Mike, I've managed to be in two places at once. Wherever you are, on or off campus, thanks for joining us today for today's keynote discussion, and special thanks to Perry Worldhouse and our sponsors for supporting the colloquium. It's great to be here, and on Penn's behalf, it's wonderful to welcome and introduce our special guest, Ben Rhodes, in conversation with Vivian Salama of the Wall Street Journal. As a former speechwriter for President Obama, Mr. Rhodes no doubt appreciates the value of brevity, so I'm going to keep my remarks short. I can't imagine someone better suited to speak at our Global Order Colloquium, and not just because his first book is titled The World as It Is. Mr. Rhodes had a front row seat to history for the entire Obama administration, serving as a deputy national security advisor for 8 years. His new book analyzes and contextualizes the recent past while also looking forward. And I'm not giving anything away when I say its title, After the Fall, gives an indication of where he thinks democratic institutions here and around the world may be headed. Ben Rhodes is also our perfect colloquium guest for another reason. Our topic this year, which is how to see the future, forecasting and global policy. It's a focus that's based in part on research on the use of crowdsourced geopolitical forecasting in government, conducted by Penn's own Philip Tetlock, Barbara Mellers, and Mike Horowitz. While in office, Mr. Rhodes received intelligence from several predictive and forecasting initiatives, many of which proved to be highly accurate, with perhaps one notable exception, the precarious state of our own democracy. Among his many accomplishments, he led secret negotiations with Cuba that resulted in normalized relations between our two countries, and he supported negotiations concluding the joint comprehensive plan of action with Iran. Both his aforementioned books are New York Times bestsellers, and his commentary and analysis often appears in The Atlantic, The Washington Post, and Foreign Affairs. And most impressive by far, he's the co-host of Pod Save the World. Ben is joined in conversation today by Ms. Salama, who is based in Washington and covers national security for the Wall Street Journal. She has covered US foreign policy and national security issues for nearly 2 decades, reporting from more than 75 countries. I expect a thoughtful and lively conversation. And now I'm going to turn it over to Ben Rhodes and Vivian Salama.
Thanks so much for that introduction. I'll start by just giving some opening comments, and then Vivian will obviously join me in conversation. But I do want to thank you, Penn, for hosting me even virtually. I hope to get back to Philadelphia at some point. I've done a lot of staring into Zoom cameras this summer. But I'll just set up kind of what the central argument in my book is, which does point to some predictive elements or some concern, at least for the future. And a useful place to start is just, why did I write this book? And then what did I learn while writing it? And for me, this began really when I was spit out at the end of the Obama presidency. I'd spent 8 years from January 20th, 2009 to January 20th, 2017 in the White House, kind of 10 years on this Obama ride. Was 29 when I went to work for the campaign, 39 on the back end. And obviously I'm spit out in the worst possible circumstance. I think it's always disorienting probably for people to leave some position of particular political influence or time under the spotlight. It's much more disorienting when your successor is immediately trying to dismantle everything that you worked on. And I'd also kind of had a building sense, particularly in the later Obama years, at the degree to which global politics was moving in the wrong direction, in an illiberal direction. In many ways, Obama cut against the political currents of that decade after the financial crisis, which I'll come back to in a second here. And so I really started to travel a lot in 2017. And part of it was just to get away. But part of it was a recognition that, like when you're in a family that has some problems, sometimes you have to step out of it and look at it from the outside to understand what's happening. I came to see that I could both understand better the connections between what was happening in the world, and particularly why was there this rise of nationalist authoritarian politics everywhere. And I could see more clearly what was happening in America from outside the kind of zoo of Trump era politics. And, a conversation that kind of kicked off the central conceit of the book, which is me investigating the rise of nationalism and authoritarianism through the experience of Hong Kong protesters, Russian oppositionists like Alexei Navalny, the Hungarian democratic opposition. This really began for me with a conversation with a Hungarian anti-corruption activist. And I asked him, how did your country essentially go from being a liberal democracy to something of a single party autocracy in a decade, from Viktor Orban's election as prime minister in 2010 till when I was talking to this activist. And he said, well, that's simple. Viktor Orban was elected on a right-wing populist backlash to the financial crisis. He redrew the parliamentary districts to entrench his party in power. He changed the voting laws to make it easier for his supporters to vote. He packed the courts with far-right judges who would find in favor of his power grabs. He enriched some cronies outside of government through corruption. Those cronies then financed his politics, and they bought up the media and turned it into a right-wing propaganda machine. And he wrapped the whole project up in a nationalist us versus them bow. Us, the true Hungarians, against them, the immigrants, the Muslims, George Soros. And as he's talking to me, I'm thinking, well, this is a pretty accurate description of my experience of American politics the last decade. And so this idea that there's a common playbook that we see leaders using everywhere to entrench authoritarian politics and to bring back a form of ethno-nationalism that really, is pre-World War II. That's the trend I set out to investigate. And the easy thing to discover was how interconnected all of these forces were. And I look at the experience of Hungary as kind of the vanguard of this strain of authoritarian nationalism, particularly in Europe. Russia as the place that really was the wellspring of what then spread to Hungary. Orban very much copied Putin's playbook that has also been copied by many other leaders around the world. But then importantly, China, where you see not just the kind of reactionary far-right nationalism of a Russia or Hungary or a Republican Party of the United States, but you see the development of an authoritarian model that is about the future and is about how societies should be organized in the future and about how technology intersects with authoritarianism. And I'll talk about that in a moment. And so this was all very clear to me. But then I think in talking to people and really investigating the degree to which America's own fingerprints were on these trends around the world, I ended up kind of looking at the 30-year period after the Cold War of American hegemony. And I had to kind of wrestle with some uncomfortable truths about the degree to which the state of global politics today is obviously impacting America. But America itself has a lot of authorship over where we find ourselves. The anecdote that kind of drove this home for me that I use in the book is I was in Shanghai with former President Obama in late 2017. And I'm woken up in my hotel room pretty late at night. And some Chinese officials wanted to speak with me. And one of them kind of delivers a démarche to me, a message that he understands President Obama's visiting India next and planning to meet with the Dalai Lama, and that this would be terribly offensive and we should cancel this meeting, et cetera. And part of what was disconcerting about this, besides the fact that there was another guy who didn't speak, but just kind of stared at the guy delivering the message to make sure he delivered it, was that we hadn't announced a meeting with the Dalai Lama. That wasn't public. I just been put in email contact with the Dalai Lama's representative. So this guy was essentially acknowledging that they're surveilling my electronic communications. And I walk outside and I kind of look at the Shanghai skyline, the Bund, which looks like the future. Skyscrapers, lights everywhere, people taking selfies with selfie sticks. And what was so interesting is in some ways it was familiar, but in some ways it was disconcerting, particularly given my experience of being woken up. But I kind of realized that if you drained all of the democracy out of the world that America made, this is what you'd be looking at. The hypercapitalism, the mania for national security, and the embrace of technology. And over the course of the book, I look at those three areas in particular in terms of how this era of American identity post-Cold War contributed to the world we find ourselves in. How the unconstrained and kind of unregulated capitalism that washed across the world after the Cold War, particularly countries on the other side of the Iron Curtain like Hungary, Russia, and China, how while that created enormous wealth and lifted a lot of people out of poverty, it created a backlash and created a sense of people's traditional identities being encroached upon. And then when the bottom fell out in the financial crisis, it opened up a huge door to people like Orban and Putin and others to take advantage of the grievances against globalization and against the greed and corruption that seemed evident in the financial crisis by tapping into the oldest political story in the book, ethno-nationalism, and this kind of post-financial crisis surge of nationalism and authoritarian politics felt very connected to me. The second area I look at in particular was the post 9/11 kind of American national security mindset. How at home that led to enormous excess, like the invasion and occupation of Iraq, but also kind of created an us versus them kind of politics, xenophobia that re-entered our politics and society and culture, that at first could be directed at terrorists. But over time, particularly as the wars went bad, if you were consuming right-wing media in this country, the vitriol that was once stirred up against another terrorist could be repurposed to focus on a Black president, immigrants at our southern border, kneeling athletes. And there's kind of a post 9/11 effect in the United States that leads to Trump. And globally, each of these authoritarian leaders has expropriated the framework of the war on terror for their own ends. Vladimir Putin used the war on terror as the rationale to cancel, for instance, direct election of governors in Russia in 2004. That Xi Jinping refers to his internment of 1 million Uyghurs as part of a people's war on terror. It doesn't make us responsible, but if as a hegemon, we are setting a highly securitized framework in which we're also ignoring certain international laws and norms, we shouldn't be surprised that other strongmen around the world utilize that framework for their own purpose. And then lastly, technology and the degree to which social media in particular was seen obviously as a perfect tool of connection and empowerment, obviously becomes the perfect tool of both disinformation and emanating from Russia as a key example, or surveillance. And that's what China is currently perfecting. And so that this blend of hypercapitalism and national security mania and new technologies that we haven't figured out how to regulate and control in ways that don't harm public safety and democracy, that these kind of structural forces and this momentum that has emanated from America in the post Cold War years is led obviously in dark directions that require a kind of global small d democratic correction. And look, to lead in the conversation, I asked about forecasts. It's not great out there. People. I think there is hope that if the United States can fight through this, we can set not just an example of how to protect a multiracial and multi-ethnic democracy for ourselves, but for the world. But I think if we look at the challenges to democracy from within this country, from without this of this country, in terms of a kind of counter-revolutionary movement from Russia and the alternative example emanating from China and the momentum behind that, there's a lot of work to be done that's going to take a long time. So with that, I'll stop, and Vivian, we'll chat about anything you guys want to talk about, the book, but I'm sure there's current events and other subjects people are interested in. So thanks for listening to that opening.
Hi, I'm starting my video. Okay.
There you are. There you are. Hey.
Little technical difficulties just to prove that we are live.
Yes.
It is so great to be with you, Ben. It's so great to be with you all. My spies on the ground tell me that you have all just received a bunch of copies of Ben's book. I have mine right here. It is a very well-loved copy with highlights and scribbles all throughout. Really interesting read. And let me say, without totally dating Ben and I, we are probably of a similar generation that we were in our early 20s or, coming out of college around the time of 9/11, when all of that was going on. And so there was a lot that we sort of faced as that 9/11 generation that was coming into the workforce. But you guys are also now at a really critical age as well, with everything that's been going on and sort of the end of those wars and all this emerging technology. All of the themes that Ben hits on in his book are things that directly impact your generation too. So I highly recommend it for all of you guys. But let's dive in, Ben. The world, something I hear when I talk to White House officials here and State Department officials is that the world is a different place now than it was when at the end of the Obama administration, when you all were leaving office, which is pretty remarkable how quickly a lot of things change. But something else I also hear from them is that, yes, President Biden is obviously not like President Trump, but he's also not President Obama. They do have a lot of differences in terms of the way they view the world, their experience, and sort of their approach to a lot of these issues that you talk about in the book. And so I want to just, since we have you here, your own personal reflections, how has the world changed based on sort of what you looked at the book, but also just in general from the last couple of years? What are the biggest changes you see in the world? And also what are some of the biggest differences you see in this new Democratic administration versus the one that you served in? How are they approaching things differently?
I mean, I think in terms of the changes, what I felt very aware of the whole time I was in government is kind of the American moment of hegemony had already crested before Obama came into office. I think that there was always going to be an artificial period of time when one country's that dominant. It's kind of inevitable that other countries challenge American dominance. And Russia and China were already beginning to do that. But also I think the Iraq War and the financial crisis kind of punctured, one a security event and the other, global financial and societal cataclysm kind of punctured the trust that, hey, the Americans are stewards of the world order and they know what they're doing. So in many ways, the Obama presidency was kind of beginning to manage the realignment that was already going to take place with an emerging China and a revanchist Russia and all manner of other emerging powers. and frankly, kind of put it on a glide path where America tried to do as much as we could to kind of settle all the accounts, to prevent new conflicts, and to begin to sketch out the kind of America we wanted to be in the world and kind of the world order that could absorb these changes. And I think with Trump's election, a process that would have been on a glide path just kind of happened all at once. That there was basically the fact of electing Trump, even more than the fact of Trump being president, the fact that we did something that reckless was like, well, that's it. We're cashing in some chips that we had with the Americans. I tell the story in the book about a group of Japanese businessmen that I was talking to at the height of the Fire and Fury stuff in 2017. I thought they wanted to talk about North Korea. All they wanted to talk about was Charlottesville and Trump. And I realized that to them, an America that had kind of lost its mind was much more dangerous and scary than a foreign policy they didn't agree with, or even in a threat like North Korea. So I think that that's what's changed, is that there's no reflexive deference to the United States on issues. We have to kind of earn our way into things. And frankly, it's even harder for the Biden folks because, if you're the Europeans and you negotiated an Iran deal for years with the United States in painstaking detail, or, you negotiated a Paris agreement that Barack Obama basically shaped, and then we just pull out of it. You're meeting with those Biden people and you're thinking, well, that's all well and good if I make an agreement with them, but what's to say Trump's not going to get elected in 3 years and just tear it all up again? And so that makes it difficult. I think in terms of the differences, there's a lot of similarities. I think they have differences in worldview. Obama had a very unique worldview for an American president. He uniquely had kind of experienced power as an outsider, as a Black man in America, as a child who lived in Indonesia after a US-sponsored coup led to hundreds of thousands of people being killed. Like I think it was a strength of his to be able to kind of step outside of the application of American power and kind of observe it. But there are, weaknesses in that too. The familiarity with the kind of levers of government, and that took time for him. Whereas Biden, on the other hand, I think saturated in Washington, so he has a deep knowledge of the kind of levers of American power and influence, but hasn't had that experience of say an Obama, of looking at it kind of from the perspective of an outsider. I think it's a little too early to tell just how that manifests itself in policy, but we can obviously get into individual policies. But by and large, I mean, there's the principal thing that's changed is the world, more than Biden being that different from Obama.
You talk a lot about democracy versus authoritarianism, and that is a very key message that President Biden has really been putting out there since he took office in January. And for folks who don't know, Ben interviewed Alexei Navalny for the book. I mean, he's got some really great anecdotes in there from a number of different countries where he looks at authoritarianism. But I'm wondering, is it enough to kind of talk about this in these big talking point style messages versus examining sort of case by case basis? Because, you talk about authoritarianism in Russia versus China. I mean, it's very different from country to country, and each challenge is very unique. And so how do you, based on everything that you picked up in writing this book, how do you approach authoritarianism as a whole, but also individual cases of it?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I found obviously, like I said, a lot of overlap, but obviously each place is unique in its own way. I think there's some things that are common everywhere. And, you mentioned Navalny. The common thing to authoritarian movements everywhere is I think they tend to recognize that they do not naturally achieve majority support. That basically most people don't want to live in authoritarian societies. And I think it's a very powerful message that even as people say, oh, look at the Chinese model, it's lifting people out of poverty and it's creating development. The Hong Kongers could have opted into that. And like the whole city tried to opt out, and to me, that's the sign of kind of people would prefer to live in freedom of some sort. Now they may define that differently in different places, but the common thread everywhere is that authoritarian governments need to make people not participate in politics, to defer to them. So there are different ways you can do that. You can do that by making it so costly to participate in politics in opposition to the authoritarian movement, that you're intimidated, and this is, why Alexei Navalny told me, this is why they poisoned me, to try to show that they can control me, or to try to send a message to every other potential Alexei Navalny that it's not worth it. But I think even beyond that, what's more unique to the US, and you see this in Russia a lot, is politics just made to look so unappealing, so dishonest, so messy and corrupt that nothing can change. It's not even worth trying. And I think that's kind of what's different today, is that the 20th century authoritarian movements were ideological. It was about Nazism or fascism or communism, worldwide revolution. Today's are just about power and people wanting power and money and trying to make other people think that it's just inevitable. And like, as Navalny said to me, Putin doesn't have to convince the Russian people that he's not corrupt. He has to convince them that everybody's corrupt. The Americans are corrupt. It's not, you might as well have a strong man who represents your grievances. And that is very much, I think, the mindset of Trump and the Republican Party. They know that people know they're lying, or they're hypocrites, but they just need to make the whole thing look so unappealing that their people are motivated by their grievances, and the rest of us are kind of turned off. Underneath that, obviously, there's a lot of differences.
Certainly media plays a role in that as well, in terms of, here, at least despite the fact that there was a lot of contention. I mean, I was a White House correspondent and we were getting called fake news every single day, but we have laws to protect us. A lot of these countries that you looked at don't have those laws to protect the journalists and the media. Yeah,
what's kind of interesting about the spectrum, Vivian, is like on the media side, in China, it's just state media. That's all there is. In Hungary, which is kind of moving in the direction of Russia, one of the characters, I have these characters who kind of tell the story of what's happened in these places, is a journalist named Szabolcs Panyi, who's a dogged investigative journalist in Hungary, does great work. But what he basically described to me is Orban basically bought up the entire media. He basically created his best friend, for instance, as a child, one of them was a plumber and is now the richest man in Hungary, a multi-billionaire. These kinds of people bought up the media. Sometimes they just bought them up and they closed them. It's like if I bought the Wall Street Journal and just shut it down, or sometimes they just turned it into a kind of state media, kind of Fox News, grievance-based nationalist platforms, and that dominates the information system. So that my character Szabolcs told me, look, I'm like one of two websites that are left, and they don't have to make it illegal for us to do what we do. But every time I publish a bad story about Orban, I just get bombarded with, you're a tool of George Soros, you're fake news, it's partisan, you don't know what, and he's like, they don't have to shut me up entirely. In a way, actually, I'm a useful foil to them, because they have such a big megaphone that they can convince their people that, okay, if they hear of this story that this guy did about corruption in the government, he's on the take too, and everybody's corrupt and don't listen to him. And so it's interesting how you don't necessarily need to have no opposition media or independent media to completely undermine the function of an independent media. And that's clearly what Trump was able to do, is still doing,
But how do you change any of this? That is to say, the internet has given some people access to events going on outside their countries, that they're able to sort of be inspired and formulate these movements. We saw that in the Arab Spring. We see it in a lot of different movements around the world. In Russia, there have been a number of protests in the last year or two, especially in opposition of Vladimir Putin. But you also have someone like Alexei Navalny, who, since your book has come out, has been poisoned and in jail and imprisoned because of his opposition to Vladimir Putin. And so, what happens? What is the formula, or have you figured that out, to really make some of these authoritarian governments finally crack and show some leeway to opposition?
Well, there are a bunch of strategies I found. I think one common thread that I saw everywhere is that the vulnerability of authoritarian movements is usually principally their corruption. and this is kind of what Navalny's explained to me, is that the potency of his message in Russia is just exposing the degree to which Putin is corrupt, because that's something that pisses everybody off. I mean, you don't have to be a super engaged, political liberal to be angry that there's this kind of corrupt cabal running the Russian state and stealing for the people. And that's why Navalny's traction was from around these kind of videos that spotlighted Russian corruption. In Hungary, same thing, that a lot of the opposition I talked to has been focused on corruption, and they've been getting more and more traction, in part because they're just exposing that underneath all this nationalist rhetoric, with Orban, this is fundamentally corrupt, a kleptocracy, essentially. And even in China, they're always, Xi Jinping is always waging anti-corruption campaigns. That's because he wants to not have the focus on the corruption around him. And obviously in the United States, I think the Democratic Party significantly underutilizes the vulnerability of corruption and moneyed interest, controlling the Republican agenda, or, frankly, you saw corruption in Trump's foreign policy, I think, with the deference to wealthy Gulf Arab regimes that clearly there are intermingling financial interests potentially at stake and at play. So I think that opposition movements need to recognize the resonance of that vulnerability. And then I think the other critical, there are of several, but I was to point to one other strategy, is to try to put a big umbrella over all the opposition to the autocracy. That the only hope in a time when there's so much momentum behind autocracy in the world, at defeating it, is if people who don't agree with the autocratic trend band together. And obviously this, in Hong Kong, that's what they tried to do very deliberately, and that allowed them to get traction, but not over the hump. In Hungary, that's what they're doing right now. 5 opposition parties for the first time have decided that even though they have huge differences among them, they're just going to run one candidate for prime minister. They're having a primary, a real innovation that could allow them to defeat Orban. In Russia, that's what Navalny was trying to do. He had an app that his organization had created that could let people know in every election who is the best candidate with the most likely chance of winning against the Putin-backed candidate. Whether that person's a communist or liberal or whatever, it's called smart voting. And actually Google and Apple buckled to Russian pressure to remove that app from their app stores. And I think in the US, the only reason Trump was defeated is because a pretty big tent of people came together. If any piece of that coalition had sat it out, Trump would have gotten reelected. So I think that recognizing the existential moment we're in and kind of forging coalitions that encompass differences is essential.
I have like 5 questions just based on that one bit alone, but I want to cover a lot of ground before we hand it over to the audience. And you just talked about that app and the tech companies sort of buckling, or the social media companies buckling to Russian pressure. What has been your experience, and you flicked at it in your introduction, about social media companies and just sort of these big tech companies versus politics, our own included, and national interests at large? I mean, where can they work together in a productive way, and where do you see it kind of going south and hurting our interests and hurting democratic interests for that matter?
So, towards the end of the book, I described, kind of relaying something like my opening comments to Obama, and him saying to me, okay, that's great. Well, what's different now? There's always a contest between democracy and authoritarianism. What really strikes you as the thing that makes this moment different? And to me, it's technology and social media. That allows, 45% of Americans to believe crazy stuff. The mass scaling up of conspiracy theory and disinformation, just literally was not possible 15 years ago. It would not have been possible to make this many Americans believe that Donald Trump won the election, or that vaccines, aren't good for you, or that people aren't responsible for climate change, or that Barack Obama wasn't born in America, or that the world is run by a cabal of child sex traffickers. The scaling up of really insidious disinformation and conspiracy theory that is servicing authoritarian politics and kind of undermining social cohesion is entirely because of these platforms. And globally, it's even worse in some places. In Russia, social media is kind of essential to Putin's kind of intimidation and control in the society. One of my characters describes it to me as like feeling it's like the effect of violence without physical violence, the brutal discourse in Russia. And in China, obviously, technology that is also a perfect tool of total surveillance, which was not possible even in, say, Soviet autocracy. You couldn't literally know kind of every single thing that a person looks at or says online in the same way. And so to me, and this gets back to your solution point, there is no way out of this without regulating social media. I mean, it's just, and I'm actually, it's interesting that the Biden team hasn't, obviously they want to get their economic agenda done first, but if you want to do one thing for democracy in this country and around the world, regulating those algorithms so they don't prioritize the spread of sensational information, because that's what they do. They're written to trigger people and engage them to get more clicks, and then introducing some liability to the companies, so they're responsible for to some extent to what's on their platform, and you'd have to work through what the warning is around that and how what they can be expected to do or not do. But Vivian, that you work at a media company, there's certain expectations that come with that. For Facebook to claim it's not a media company, but to be the single largest source of information to Americans is an unsustainable threat to democracy and public safety.
Super fascinating. You mentioned China, and I would love to just touch upon that issue, because President Biden has said it's the largest challenge that his administration faces, and that echoes the Trump administration. And it is largely becoming a very bipartisan issue in terms of countering Chinese aggression and just its rising economic and political influence or military influence, while also trying to work with it. Working with China has proven more difficult than the Biden administration would have liked, now 7-8 months in. So I'm wondering, where do you see it? You talk about it a little bit in the book. Where do you see the US-China relationship going, and sort of where's the breaking point or the potential breaking point, if any?
I mean, I think it's going in a confrontational direction. I think, Xi Jinping is a different character. China's been, a couple of things happened, or, 3 things really happened. First, I described, the effect of the financial crisis. A Hong Kong official who spoke to me anonymously had a great line. He said to me, 2008 is when the narrative of liberalism and democracy collapsed in the West. And it's also when the Chinese Communist Party looked around and said, why are we deferring to these guys? They just tanked the global economy. We can now assert ourselves more. We can challenge, instead of kind of deferring to America on a lot of stuff, so long as we left them alone. Now and that was certainly my experience in the Obama years, like a more assertive China. Then Xi Jinping comes into power, and he's just a different character. And individuals matter in history, and he enlarged the ambition of the Chinese Communist Party to project influence outside of China. And then Trump comes along and kind of discredits American democracy. And then so the Chinese are thinking, well, we are in the driver's seat internationally. I worry that this is moving towards kind of a confrontation that ignores that the most important thing that we have to do to compete with an alternative model of society that the Chinese Communist Party has is to fix our own multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy. I mean, that's much more important than nuclear subs in Australia, as much as that may be necessary. And so I would like us to channel a lot of the energy towards getting our own house in order, because no foreign policy is going to succeed against China or dealing with China or working with China if we are insane at home, which is what
I want to actually read a passage from the book. You write, and it's toward the beginning, so it kind of sets the tone. It says, to be American in 2020 was to live in a country diminished in the world, unwilling to control the spread of a disease or face up to our racism and looking over the precipice of abandoning the very democracy that was supposed to be the solid core of our national identity. And so you really hit upon that issue. And it's something that we're still talking about, 3/4 of the way into 2021, where the Biden administration sort of vowed to restore America's standing in the world, its image. And yet we've had a couple of bumps in the road. The Afghanistan withdrawal angered a lot of our allies. We even just had the French ambassador recalled for consultation to Paris, although that was very short-lived, thankfully. And you just have these little hiccups in the relationship. And you talk to administration officials and they say it's a hard world and these things happen, but it's sort of the fundamentals behind the administration that will kind of restore it. And so, without dragging on myself, where are we going? I mean, where do we stand today? And what do you think we need to convince our allies that like America is really back, as opposed to just, key phrases and talking?
Yeah, I mean, again, first of all, at the risk, well, no, obviously I'm partisan on these, like the most important thing we could do is pass HR 1, the rest of the world sees how dysfunctional American democracy is. And we should understand that we're like on a spectrum here. We're not a democracy or an autocracy, but we're somewhere in between. And, when politicians are choosing their voters and drawing their own districts and money is awash in politics and there are laws that are allowing elected officials to overturn will of voters, like the rest of the world is watching that too. And so to me, we and like I mentioned social media, like the rest of the world is in Europe is furious about that. I mean, their politics have been ravaged by American-made social media platforms that we then defend against European regulation. And so to me, this all begins with ourselves and what kind of country we are and what kind of country we want to be. Then I think that in terms of our relationships with our allies, I think part of the problem is the national security enterprise that I was once a part of was built at a time when America was like a hegemon and a superpower and could go tell people what to do. And that's just not how the world is anymore. No, Washington is the only place where people seem to think that, you can pull a lever and, something will happen automatically on the other side of the world. They don't want to sign up to our China policy. They want to make a China policy with us, or they'll go make their own China policy. So I think what the Biden team is finding is they can't just expect allies to kind of fall in line with an American view when America looks so erratic in the world and such a mess at home. And so it'll take time to kind of, I think that our foreign policy needs to adjust to like a reality that we've been in a new era here, and we're gonna have to meet people halfway, and we're gonna have to consult before we do things, and we're gonna have to acknowledge our own shortcomings when we're issuing lectures about democracy. I would argue, Vivian, too, like we're gonna have to be more consistent on democracy itself. Like, you can't really say democratic values are back, but except for the Saudis and the Egyptians or whoever, good friends of ours and in the Middle East. So I think a lot, it's going to take time for America to kind of adjust to the fact that we don't call the shots.
Last week was the UN General Assembly. A lot of countries kind of back physically participating in it, including President Biden. I spoke with a lot of visiting foreign delegations. And one of the things I kept on hearing sort of behind the scenes is just the astonishment of a lot of our allies to what happened here on January 6th. Just unfathomable for something like that to happen in the United States. And yet, there is and has been since then a lot of discussion about the inevitability of it, just the building of white nationalism in this country that was going unaddressed for so long. And so why do you think it went so long without really being addressed, at least even at the president's level? President Biden really had it in his inauguration address, and has commissioned a study and a team to look into it. But why did it take so long, do you think?
Because I think, I describe like in the book, you mentioned us kind of being in the 9/11 generation. That's also a generation that kind of politically came of age in the 90s when everything had happy endings. You know, we'd won the Cold War and democracy won. There was this kind of inevitability to American exceptionalism, and so I think on number one, Americans forgot or needed to be reminded that we are a part of the world, that the same things that happen everywhere can happen here. I mean, when I was in government, plenty of countries had a corrupt autocrat with a son-in-law down the hall running the country. Plenty of countries had a mob storm the parliament. We are a part of the world. Those things can happen here. And I think Americans need to recognize the degree to which, we're not immune to these things. I think the second thing is that, like, look, this is just, it's uncomfortable to acknowledge the radicalism of what's been going on around us. And I, Vivian, got very frustrated in the later Obama years at, hey, these aren't the same, like my dad was a Republican, like, he's from Texas, and like these aren't those guys. Like the people who started to get elected, particularly in 2010 with the Tea Party wave. And these were different extreme characters who didn't recognize norms, and they were crossing lines and tapping deep veins of racism and white supremacy that kind of more responsible political leadership at least kept at arm's length, right? I'm not saying we ever solved those problems, but I remember being in the White House, and that when Trump emerged with the birther movement, I mean, it's kind of insane that basically a reality. I mean, I helped Obama a little bit looking at this for his book. I went back and read all the media transcripts, and there's Donald Trump, who's just, what is he? He's a reality show guy. He's getting booked on like every morning show. It wasn't just Fox. He was on like Good Morning America and the Today Show, and with just some racist theory that the president who's black was born in Africa. And then even at that time, I remember if you called that racist, it was like, whoa, playing the race card there, and what else is it when someone comes along and says that the first black president was born in Africa? And then there were polls at that time, 70, 80% of Republicans believe it. Well, what is that? And I think it's just been hard for whatever reason to find the language to describe what is really a white supremacist, white nationalist movement with deep fascist undertones that is sitting like in the Capitol. That's what it is. But like, just what I just said would be like, oh, rein it in, partisan guy. But like, it's not a partisan statement from my perspective. It's a factual observation about what's happening around us.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask one last really quick question, and then we're going to go to the audience. You have a chapter in the book called Forever Wars. Obviously, this was published before the withdrawal, but just in terms of looking back the last 20 years, what do you think the biggest lesson we learned from these Forever Wars was?
I mean, I think that the Forever Wars ended up becoming a reflection of all the excesses of America's kind of post 9/11 identity. This insistence on total security, this belief that we could reshape events in other countries, this belief that the rules don't apply to us, that we want other countries to play by, that, you have and I describe in the book, the set of decisions made after 9/11. I mean, it's going to take time for history to draw out how consequential, to invade and start a nation building project in Afghanistan, and then a year later to do that in Iraq, and there's torture and there's Gitmo I think that die was cast in a way of overreach from the very beginning. And then in the book, I'm quite critical of things that happened in the Obama years. What's interesting to me is that the stuff we were criticized for at the time was not what, when I look back, I'm most critical of. At the time, we were usually criticized for restraint, for not going in, and using military action in Syria or Iran, or not being sufficiently committed to the mission in Afghanistan. But when I look back, the mistakes were the overreach, was the surge in Afghanistan, or the support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen. And you mentioned the Allied discontent around Biden's withdrawal. I think there's a lot to criticize and obviously how that unfolded. But I think that, to be fair to Biden, that's really the bill come due for 20 years. He just happened to be the president at the time. And so I do think a decisive break from the post 9/11 era is essential to move into something different. And just withdrawing from Afghanistan is not a decisive break. There's, to me, as I detail in the book, it's also the mindset that backs true autocratic dictators like Sisi. If we are prioritizing quote unquote security and selling out democracy in that way, well, why wouldn't we do that at home too? We've not prioritized democracy in our foreign policy or our domestic politics as much as we should.
Really interesting stuff. Some great questions from the audience. Let's get through a couple of these. Some of you are anonymous. Tell us who you are. We would love to hear from you. First question is, what do you see as the probability expressed quantitatively as a percentage that the US will cease to be a liberal democracy by 2030? These are very smart questions.
Yeah. Like I said, and I'll come back and actually give you a number, but part of what was interesting for me in writing the book was to think about, well, there are ways in which we are already not a liberal democracy, right? To me, what's interesting is to stop thinking about things in terms of there are democracies and then there are autocracies. No, there are, within every society, if the democracy is one end of a spectrum and to kind of totalitarianism, a democracy where everybody's equal and has equal rights and those rights are respected, if that's kind of 0 and totalitarianism is 100, everybody's kind of moving around in that spectrum. There are states within the United States, I think, that are less liberal democracies than others. And, Texas, between abortion laws and restrictive voting laws, and, the Texas legislature is not acting. It's like a liberal democracy here. So we're already kind of moving back and forth on this spectrum. Where I am in California, it's a pretty liberal democracy, I think, relative to what it might be the experience of living in other states. But I think on the kind of question that is being gotten at, I think it's a better than 50% chance that when you look at the momentum behind entrenching minority rule of the majority in this country, the Republican Party doesn't even make any pretense of seeking to win a majority of votes nationally in the popular vote for president or the overall popular vote for House and Senate. Their entire political identity is about manipulating American institutions to entrench political power well beyond their vote share, whether it's their focus on the courts or their focus on state legislatures and redistricting and the way in which they use money in politics. So to me, every election feels kind of existential. And so to me, this is a less than 50% proposition when you look at the next decade.
Really interesting. Here's a question about India, which is timely since we just had Prime Minister Modi at the White House last week. Now that the US has withdrawn from Afghanistan, India remains the only secular and stable, or at least semi-stable, democracy in the region. How will or should this shape US foreign policy in South Asia?
I think that, there's been one constant in American foreign policy through all these different administrations. You can't get much different from, Clinton to Bush to Obama to Trump to Biden. But the kind of steady progression of the US and India cooperating more closely has been one constant. And I think that's because if you look out at the world and you look at particularly China and Russia and the kind of inevitability of how those nations are going to challenge a certain kind of global order and certainly democracy itself, that there's a natural alignment of interest between the US and India on a lot of things. I think that, India, like the United States, their politics mirrors a lot of what's happening here. I could have written a whole section on India for this book. In fact, I contemplated doing that and even had a long trip to India planned right when the pandemic happened, because, the BJP under Narendra Modi is is very much aligned with the trend I'm talking about, right-wing ethno-religious nationalist politics. And so my hope is that the United States, doesn't approach India as, as just Narendra Modi. That there's a deeper engagement with the opposition, with the BJP, with civil society. We have an interest in India being a successful, multi-denominational, multi-ethnic democracy too. We're not perfect here, so it's not like we can sit here and just issue lectures. But to me, there's going to be a natural alignment of interest. But my hope would be that both the U.S. and India can do better than we've been doing in recent years at living up to the story we tell about ourselves as democracy.
The question about India actually made me wonder your thoughts on vaccine advocacy globally. Obviously there's a GDP element to it in terms of the wealthier countries are able to sort of disperse and get access to these vaccines in a bigger way. But how does democracy factor into that equation as well, in terms of, are the autocratic countries struggling with it more? I mean, you see Russia, there's a great NPR story about Russia's struggles with it in terms of convincing the public to get vaccinated, despite the fact that Vladimir Putin has himself talked about it. Do you have any thoughts about sort of the pandemic and how it plays into the theme of your book?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's notable is that the countries that have handled the pandemic the worst are all countries that have precisely this character of leader, kind of ethno-nationalist, strongman type, and man, they're all men. But if you look, I would say the countries that have handled this the worst in terms of the scale of the outbreak and the kind of unnecessary suffering would be the United States, Brazil under Bolsonaro, Russia under Putin, India under Modi. There's a reason for that. I mean, part of that is that those types of leaders tend to elevate their cult of personality above things like science. They also, frankly, have elevated a lot of kind of conspiracy theory-based discourse online that suits their interests that they then can't control when it becomes anti-vaccine. So, if you, Donald Trump or Narendra Modi or Bolsonaro or Putin, if you've been hyping, certain voices because they're super nationalist and back you up, and then you say, oh, don't listen to them on this vaccine thing though. Well, why would you think that that's going to be the case? So, and I do think that, one of the Russians I spoke to thought that the pandemic could, if there's any hope in it, it could be a kind of circuit breaker for this nationalism, because it could make people value a certain kind of governance that is fact-based and a certain kind of community in which people look out for each other. Remains to be seen if that's what comes out of this pandemic. I do think you could make a pretty good argument that Joe Biden wouldn't have been elected without this pandemic, though. So that may confirm at least the possibility that Maria Stepanova, the woman who said that to me, is right.
Very interesting. A debt ceiling question from Theo Milanopoulos at Perry Worldhouse. For the second time in a decade, the U.S. is heading toward a crisis over its debt ceiling and living in a shadow of looming government shutdown. Based on your experience in other countries and at the White House during the last crisis, how do you expect Washington to continue careening into these crises, and what will it take to avoid it in the future?
I mean, I think that the two things I'd say about the debt limit contextually are one, to me, it underscores the radicalism of the Republican Party. The Democratic Party did not like Donald Trump. This did not happen. And there are certain things that it's not because Democrats are right about everything. I'm sure I'm wrong about a bunch of stuff and the size of government or foreign policy, but the idea that you don't put at risk the entire American and global economy to, as part of some gamesmanship in Washington or effort to sabotage a Democratic presidency, that it does show a degree of radicalization. And I think secondly, it undermines the idea that America is a competent and functioning superpower. I mean, I love these Republicans who, would, bash us for undermining American credibility because we didn't go to war in some country, or, we just needed to give, more energetic assertions of American exceptionalism around the world instead of being on a quote unquote apology tour. And then they're voting to to tank the economy. Like it's not serious. Like it's just not serious. And I don't see how it changes. I just don't. It's going to keep happening. We are going to keep careening from crisis to crisis. Because until like one of America's major political parties decides that that's not the kind of thing they'll do, they'll keep doing it. And one of these days, I mean, with Trump, the dog caught the car. I mean, there's no reason to think they one of these days they will probably hit the debt ceiling and tank their economy. I mean, there was a mob that stormed the parliament or the Congress, and they didn't change their orientation. So unfortunately, I think this is kind of part of the backdrop of things.
And this is with the president's party having the majority, a slim majority, albeit in both the House and the Senate. So it'll be interesting to see if that changes, how difficult things would be.
Yeah.
Dr. Sarah Plana, who is also at Perry Worldhouse, asks, you spoke here in the book about the impact of the US's wide-ranging war on terror on emboldening authoritarian arguments for repression, among other human costs. The US still conducts strikes and other uses of force against people across the globe in the name of counterterrorism. Do you advocate for ending American use of force against terrorism, given the costs? And I'm going to add to that is, the administration now is taking an over-the-horizon approach to the war in Afghanistan and several other of these wars. And so sort of factoring into that, how does that all play into where things are going?
Yeah, I think and when I alluded to kind of needing to do more to dismantle the infrastructure post 9/11, I think it's like we are using military force to kill people in a lot of countries, in if Yemen, Somalia, Libya, other parts of North Africa, obviously Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Syria. To me, the kind of normalization of having a vast infrastructure dedicated to killing people, if that's not going to fuel authoritarianism, I don't know what is. If you look at America's kind of quote unquote closest partners in the war on terror, they've all become more autocratic. I mean, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, certainly Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. So this, to me, look, I've been in national security. Like, you have to use military force sometimes. There may be a target that necessitates it, but I think it should be an exception. So to take the issue of drone strikes, which was alluded to, I think the whole idea should not be that this is something we're doing, just kind of as a matter of course in all these places. If there's a drone strike taken, that should be news. Like, that should be something we have to come out and explain why we took it, be public about it, don't do it in secret. That's another big thing, moving all this into transparency. You shouldn't just kind of have a normalized machinery of war in all these countries. Because yes, that both changes something about ourselves. It empowers autocrats. And yes, it has been used as a justification, kind of a whataboutism for just about everything that Russia and China have done. So I would like to see that dismantled to the degree to which it's an exceptional thing for us to say, take a drone strike. And look, someone in the intro mentioned me reading intelligence. Like, if we can't trust this apparatus we built of counterterrorism and law enforcement, and you're taking off your shoes at the airport, like 9/11 can't really happen. I think with this, you don't need to be killing people in all these places. We should be able to trust that our intelligence and law enforcement is going to prevent catastrophic terrorist attacks, even if it obviously can't prevent anybody from, with a gun from killing Americans. So to me, it's time to dismantle and kind of remake and reimagine what American national security is and what it's focused on. And terrorism should be way down the list relative to issues like climate change, democracy, and technology.
What about the double-edged sword, though, of scaling back U.S. operations in a lot of these countries, but selling weapons to countries like Saudi Arabia and Egypt, where in some cases they either use it recklessly on other countries or against their own populations? Yeah,
I wouldn't do it. I mean, I did tell the story in the book about Mohammed Sultan, who was an Egyptian American who went back to Egypt after Tahrir Square. He's there for the hopeful moment when Mubarak's removed. And then when the military comes back to power in 2013, he's shot, he's imprisoned, he's tortured, he in the most vivid and gruesome ways. He goes on a hunger strike to protest his detention. And they literally put an ISIS recruiter in his cell. And this guy is debating an ISIS recruiter, American citizen, detained and tortured by a government that gets billions of dollars in American assistance. And that government lets the ISIS recruiter in a cell. Why do they do that? They do that because the radicalization of opposition in Egypt is what justifies both the repression and the billions of dollars. It's just time to stop this. Like, this is not working. Like, it's not working on counterterrorism because, as Mohammed said to me, there's 60,000 people in those Egyptian prisons, and some of them are being radicalized as we speak by the treatment that they're receiving. Ayman Zawahiri, Al Qaeda was born out of prison cells like that, and so to me, I have the luxury of being outside of government now, so I can be more categorical. But I don't know why you'd provide military assistance to Egypt and Saudi Arabia.
But there's a lot of talk also about countries like China and Russia filling the vacuum, the void that the U.S. is leaving behind in some of these countries.
I would, that very well may happen, but what are we winning exactly here? Like what is Egypt? A democracy? Is it? So to me, America has got to stand for something, and should be looking to deepen relationships with allies and other emerging democracies. If the idea that we have to draw this contrast with China and there's this existential competition between democracy and autocracy, but we have to make carve-outs for a whole bunch of autocrats. Well, that's not suggesting, do you think there's an existential crisis between democracy and autocracy? That's suggesting that actually autocracy can be quite convenient, and I think people are onto that. Like, people have been on that for a long time. And look, I know it's never purely ideal. There's always, nations always, there's a realism to foreign policy. I'm not suggesting that there's never going to be times that you can adhere to some perfect standard, but there's some pretty glaring cases out there. And I think Egypt and Saudi Arabia are at the top of the list.
Interesting. Alan Luxemburg, from the former president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, asks, former Pennsylvania State Senator Dalen Leach has predicted that while Trump may not win in 2024, he will be the next president, given the current Republican machinations around the country. What do you think?
I think that's a very possible, if not likely, scenario. I think the thing about this gets back to what I was saying about people not wanting to see what is happening before their eyes, or not wanting to call what's happening what it is. One thing that's been pretty consistent is that, like, there's a reason that Republicans take certain actions, right? Like, there was a reason Mitch McConnell didn't allow Merrick Garland to even get a hearing, right? Because they wanted to remake the Supreme Court, and they have. And look what's happening now. There's a reason that they're passing laws in places like Georgia and Texas to allow state legislators to overturn the result of an election. Like, why would they be doing that if they didn't see a scenario in which they would act on it? I mean, they're just doing it. I mean, it's not a coincidence that basically a lot of effort at the state level in the Republican Party since Trump's defeat has been giving themselves tools and powers to prevent that from happening again. Like, so, I for one believe that you should, believe your own eyes. And if they didn't think that there was a scenario in which they would overturn a democratic result, then why would they be passing these laws to allow them to do just that?
It's a question we're going to be addressing
a
lot in coming months and years, I reckon. Someone anonymous asks, as a policymaker, what do you see as the most useful way that geopolitical forecasting can help inform policy, and how do you think those insights can best be communicated? These are very smart questions.
It's a very smart question. So, what I used to say, when I was in government, and that had the perspective of consuming a lot of intelligence reports, is for forecasting in particular, I thought that analyses of trends were much more useful than trying to like predict what was going to happen in some foreign country. We think that because that's a fraud exercise. I mean, it was the analysis of a lot of the intelligence community that like Bashar al-Assad wasn't gonna be able to hang on. The idea that we can just predict what's going to happen in this country and that country, to me, that's a lot to ask of the intelligence community. And of course, they're going to hedge, because who wants to have to say, like, who would have predicted what's happened in the United States? But think about this: like, we live here, right? Like, presumably, we know a lot about America. Would like anybody in this country besides Donald Trump like have predicted in 2008 that like he'd be president in 8 years? So like, why would we think our intelligence community can like tell us what's going to happen in some country? But we can understand what climate change is going to do to the world and how that might inform scarcity of resources and potential conflict over resources, or how that might impact the flow of refugee populations and migrant populations going forward. We can project what people might do, foreign adversaries or malign actors, with new artificial intelligence. So to me, like, trend-based forecasting is much more useful and usually, constructive to a policymaker than a policymaker saying, I used to feel terrible for because most deputies and principals committee meetings in the White House begin with like an intelligence report. And I always felt terrible at the meetings that would devolve into like, so what do you think is going to happen, in Ukraine in 6 months? And it's like, I mean, it's not their job to read the future. It's their job to tell you what's happening.
Dr. Michael Franczak, I hope I pronounced that right, sir, asks, how do you compare the G7's proposal this summer for Build Back Better World as counter to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative?
Well, one has a lot of money behind it and the other has none. I mean, I totally support the motivation, but like the Belt Road Initiative is like a massive infrastructure project with a ton of money in it. And a lot of that money, by the way, is not like real. It's like debt traps for countries that participate in Belt Road Initiative projects. But to me, the impulse behind the Build Back Better World thing is the right one, which is that the democracies need to be more relevant partners to developing countries in any country in terms of like what people are seeking. I mean, I remember when I came into government, Vivian, and I had to write the Cairo speech, we did like an audience analysis. I was like, well, I just came out of a political campaign. What are the 5 things that countries with majority Muslim populations, what do those people want to do with us? what do they see as positive about America that they want to work with us on? And it was education, entrepreneurship, science and technology. It wasn't terrorism and nuclear weapons. And I realized that basically, like, we spend most of our time talking to other countries about things that they don't really care about, and the Chinese are showing up and they're talking about roads and infrastructure and, power projects and stuff. And like, of course, that's an advantage for them. So the idea of us pivoting in that direction is right. But you know what? Like, at a certain point, there's got to be money and financing behind it. And, where you can get creative about where that comes from is like, there's financing mechanisms that aren't just like hard dollar foreign aid, but like, I think we have to recognize that it's like the Central America approach to migration. It's the kind of thing that is worth doing, but it's going to take 5, 10, 15 years to build that up.
Mm-hmm. I want to go back to the 2024 question and really actually focus on 2022 for a second, because I'm curious about, what you think some of the big issues are for voters today. 15 years ago, the war on terror was still something that dominated. It was important to people. The 9/11 trauma was still sort of lingering in the minds of so many. a lot of the students that we're talking to today weren't even born when 9/11 happened. And so there is obviously a shift in the country. You do talk about that a little bit in terms of how 9/11 was such a focal point for people in the years following. But what are the issues now? And I particularly ask it because in the last few weeks with the Afghanistan issue, it's really revved Trump up. He's been putting out a lot of messaging that's linked to the handling of the Afghanistan withdrawal. But there's always a question, and I talk about this with folks everywhere, is, do voters really care about that kind of issue anymore? What are the issues? And when it comes to foreign policy, especially, where do you think the big issues are that voters do care about, if at all?
So I think this is on the right, since 2008, when John McCain ran against Barack Obama on a set of actual policies, there's no issue that matters except the degree to which a whole bunch of issues are just kind of rolled together into some big ball of fear that is meant to mobilize Republican voters. That's my experience of every election since 2008. And the fears can change, right? So it's not like anybody's going to go into the voting booth and be like, man, I would vote for this Democratic congresswoman, but that Afghan withdrawal is really mismanaged by Biden. No, what it is they'll roll together, scenes in Afghanistan, crime on our streets, chaos at our border, whatever the thing that people are pissed off about on Fox, they'll roll that into some ball of grievance. And in 2014 midterms, it was like Ebola and unaccompanied children and and Ferguson and Black Lives Matter. In 2016 it was Iran is an interesting issue in politics. It's not because anybody has considered views about how to deal with Iran's nuclear program. It's just they're scary and other and brown and they're building weapons and then we're giving them pallets of cash and this is not a foreign policy argument. It's an identity argument, and so that's what the right will do in this election. I think what's harder for Democrats is Democratic constituencies have much more splintered interests. Some people want to hear about young people want to hear about climate change and climate action. Older people want to hear about healthcare policy, right? And what the Democrats need to do, I think what Obama did well in his general elections is he wove it all together into one message about, if we come together, he's basically had a message about American identity, that if we cooperate across races and religions and ethnic groups, we can make our democracy do big things. And that can be healthcare, that can be climate, that can be, but there has to be a core motivating force behind it, in the same way that there is a very potent core motivating force behind right-wing messaging in this country and around the world.
One of the things that we haven't touched upon is the border crisis, and Western Hemisphere, as a whole. The Obama administration obviously kind of broke a perpetual isolation with Cuba and warmed up, started engaging diplomatically. That was reversed by the Trump administration, and we haven't seen a reversal back, despite the Biden administration's decision to go back to a number of the older policies, including the Iran nuclear deal. So I'm curious, where do you see sort of Western Hemisphere issues going? And that includes Cuba, the border crisis, and any other issues, Venezuela.
Well, if you asked, earlier about differences, to me, the biggest and most disappointing difference thus far in the Biden foreign policy is its Latin America policy, and its Cuba policy is Latin America policy. That this matters way out of proportion to an island of 11 million people, because it's kind of the prism through which the U.S. is engaged in the Americas. It's a proxy for all the ugly things we've done in history. And to me, it's incredibly self-defeating policy. The Biden team in keeping the Trump policy essentially in place. I think, probably for, all those people were in government with me, supporting the opening, that was working quite well until Trump slammed the door. there must be some political motivation here, whether that's the power of Bob Menendez as the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee or Florida or whatever it is. But here's the problem with it. Like, it's not just the Cuba issue. It's your capacity to solve Venezuela is out the door. Your credibility in Latin America at a time when I see that region moving left. If you look at Argentina, if you look at Peru, if you look at Bolivia, like the pendulum is swinging back to the left down there. Lula's out of prison in Brazil. If we kind of carry the albatross of the old Cuba policy around with us, I think it undermines our capacity to kind of sit down and solve problems. I mean, when people ask me, like, what are the benefits of the Cuba opening? One of the things I always point to is, like, we negotiated the end of the Colombian Civil War in Havana. Like, that was much easier to do because you had an American representative envoy down there with the Cubans and the left-wing, FARC, and then the Colombian government. And, so that to me is, I worry that they're going to have real problems in Latin America if they don't evolve their Cuba policy back towards where it was at the end of the Obama administration. I obviously have a lot of pride of engagement on that policy, so I don't, obviously, people can take what I say from that perspective. But in the border too, I just think that it's the hardest problem in government in a way, because you can't open up the border, and so inherently they're going to be disappointment. But I think part of what broke through with the Haitian images was like, well, but we can conduct ourselves in a certain way that is respecting the legal rights of these people to petition for asylum, and that doesn't look like the worst excesses of like the Trump years. So they have some work to do in this space, and I think they know that. And I know Ali Mayorkas well. He's one of the most decent human beings I ever interacted with in government. I'm sure that this is hard. It takes time to affect from Washington what's happening on some stretch of border. So I'm not on the border stuff. Like the Cuba stuff is, they made a choice. On the border stuff, it's just hard. But I think they absorbed the lesson last week that they have to up their up their effort level at least changing the way in which the situation is being managed.
That question inspired someone else to ask about Africa, specifically the group heard from President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf this morning, who said the future of the world is the world economy. Is Africa, and they want to know what you think about that.
I think that she's not off. I mean, if you look at the age of the African population, I forget the year at which like half the world's young people will be African. That's approaching. I think that I'd throw Southeast Asia. I became very focused on Southeast Asia. So when I look out at regions that are going to play an increasing and larger role in the global economy and in the fate of these issues that we're discussing, I think sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia kind of stand out to me. And that's, like you said, the thing about, well, oh my gosh, I'm not assigning it to you, Vivian, but like you represented the view of what if we stop selling weapons to Egypt, then the Russians will sell them the weapons. And I'd rather spend that time down in like sub-Saharan Africa building relationships with these very big countries that have growing economies. I'd rather be spending that time in Southeast Asia. Like there are a lot of countries in the world. Guess where China's paying attention, right? Like they're very focused on Africa. They're very focused on Southeast Asia. So they're seeing it, we have to kind of increase the quality and quantity of our engagement in a place like sub-Saharan Africa. I think it's too securitized right now. You want to talk about 9/11. You travel around Africa, their principal prison through which they see the U.S. policy down there is often AFRICOM, where the people come in and do the counterterrorism stuff or sell weapons or train security forces with dubious, human rights records. There's huge exceptions to that. PEPFAR in the Obama years, Power Africa to bring electricity. But like, I do think that the nature of our engagement, the balance of it should shift away from security, and probably to really clean energy, because that's both something that Africans want, and you can't solve the climate crisis if countries going through phases of development like don't skip over the dirty ones to the clean ones.
Ben, we have about a little less than 3 minutes left. And Jake Schwartz was the first question I got. And it's the one I'm closing with. A number of people, including Jake, want to know, what advice do you have for people like them who want to get into public service and who admire your career? And what have you learned in your career?
I mean, for me, like, I obviously had some privilege and some luck along the way. What worked for me is I never set out to be in a certain job and like build a resume to get to that job. Like, I was drawn to come down to Washington to write and learn about foreign policy and work on it after 9/11. I worked for someone I really admired. That always helps. In Lee Hamilton, I worked on issues I cared about. I met people and tried to learn from them. I said yes to a lot of extra, hey, can you help out on this campaign? And obviously I followed my passion to work for Barack Obama, and that was the luck. But what I'd say to people is that particularly young people, like, I meet too many people who think that, they have to build this resume with these internships and this, credential and that. You will be better at what you do if you admire who you work for or are passionate about the issue you work on. Like, that's what's going to make you work that extra hour at night or find that extra gear to do well, rather than just kind of being miserable in some crappy office. And do you prefer
campaign work to administration? I mean, do they latch onto administration? Can they come to DC? What do you think?
So I also think that it's a much bigger field than people think. People forget there's NGOs, there's activism. Everybody should find their own thing. It doesn't have to necessarily be like right through DC. For me, I do believe being on a political campaign, a presidential campaign, was immensely useful, because it's seeing how politics interacts with actual people. I had to look at issues through that prism for a period of time in a way that I thought gave me something. Yes, I didn't have as much, as was often pointed out, national security experience as some of the people in the room with me, but those people had no concept of how the things that they sat at think tanks and thought about interacted with like actual voters and actual citizens of this country. And the same thing, by the way, true, I'd level the criticism of Americans don't think about what happens around the world. So to me, it doesn't have to be a political campaign, but something that kind of gets you out there. Like an activism or NGO job that takes you somewhere else in the world. Even being in a congressional office, you at least have to think about, how are my constituents responding to this? Things that kind of put you at somewhere outside of just the contemplation of these issues, as important as that is, and as important as places like Penn are. But if you're young and entering into the field, like doing something that is where these ideas make contact with reality, I think is useful.
Thank you so much. We have to leave it there, guys, but it's been a pleasure, Ben. Always great to talk to you. Ben's book, After the Fall, guys, it's great. You're going to learn a lot, I promise. Pick up your copy, and hopefully we'll do this again. Thank you so much to Perry.
Thanks so much, Vivian.
Thanks a lot, Ben and Vivian. This was an incredible conversation, and thank you to the audience for joining us for our final keynote of the 2021 Global Order Colloquium. I hope you'll join us again next Tuesday for The World Today, with a roundtable of former U.S. ambassadors to discuss from military might to strategic partnerships, the U.S. and the Middle East. We'll put a link to register in the chat. And as always, you can access a recording of this conversation on our YouTube channel, and you can stay connected with us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Perry Worldhouse. Thanks again for being with us today. And thanks to you, Ben and Vivian, for our fantastic conversations, and congratulations on the book, Ben.
Thank you, guys. Thanks.
Have a great day, everybody.